we were talking last time about the extraordinary conflict between man and nature which exists among almost all highly civilized peoples, and especially here in the Western world, where we talk so much about our conquest of nature, our mastery of space, our subjection of the physical world. And I think one of the main reasons why we feel in this particular way is that each individual experiences himself as a peculiarly separate being. In other words, every man thinks of this world as a collection of objects. The world is a lot of things, and each person considers himself as a thing. And I wonder if you've ever stopped to ask yourself what a thing is and why you think you are a thing. Are you quite sure that you are a thing? Because if we take a look at ourselves from another point of view, for example like this, we shall find that we are not one thing at all. We're an extraordinary number of things. For what you're looking at there is the cell structure of your own body, a whole multitude of tiny, tiny little individuals. And now, we might ask again, what other points of view could we take to ourselves? We could, of course, take the sociologist's point of view, where we're not really a thing at all, but a sub-member of a group. Or still more, if a man visiting us from another planet in something like a flying saucer were to hover down and look at what sort of creature is inhabiting this earth, what would he see? Let's take a look and get some idea of his view. This is the kind of creature he would find inhabiting this planet. A sprawly, nubbly thing with various lines connecting bits of it. That would be, in his view, the kind of thing that we are. For you see, how many things we are depends upon the point of view which one takes. Every point of view that we've taken, the point of view of the cells, the point of view of the man hovering above the earth in a flying saucer or an aeroplane, is a correct point of view. And according to the way in which we look, so we divide the things of the world. For you see, it's interesting, isn't it, that the word thing is very like the word think. Because by breaking down our world into things is the way in which we think about it. We break down what we call the material world into objects and assign to those objects the kind of words we describe as nouns. And then the world of action we break into events and assign to events the kind of word we call verbs. But things and events are fundamentally the ways of breaking up our complex world so that we can think about it. I wonder if any of you have ever been to a psychologist and taken a Rorschach test and been asked to look at one of these extraordinary blots. Now, actually, the blot that we're looking at here isn't a real Rorschach blot because you're not allowed to show them in public in case people saw them before the test. But they're something like this. And they're made by splodging ink on paper and folding the paper over so that you get a symmetrical block. And the psychologist says to you when you look at that, "Now, please, will you tell me a story about it? What do you think it looks like?" And you might say, "Well, I think it looks like a great big cat face, or maybe it's a woman's handbag, or maybe it's a dancer waving his arms in front of a pair of pine trees with some rocks around." All sorts of stories you could invent about it, anything you like. And the psychologist will use the kind of information that you've given him, the sort of things that you project out of your own mind into that blot, and he will then form some diagnosis of the kind of person you are. But you see, he's not interested in the information which you give him about the blot as a description of the blot. He's interested in what you say as a description of what is going on inside you. In other words, what you are saying about that blot is a projection of yourself into its strange and complicated conformations. Now you see, our whole world is in many ways not so very much unlike this peculiar blot. And you might think that there might be some persuasive person who stands up and gives a story about the blot of the world, and other people agree with what he says. He says, look here, that's a mountain, that's a tree, that's a rock. And everybody else would agree because he was so persuasive. And we would all be beginning to give the same story about the cosmic Rorschach blot. Because after all, our world is a very wiggly affair. Consider, for example, clouds. Or clouds with mountains across them. Or waters. Or stars. All the world is a wiggly affair. Not at all unlike that blot we were looking at. And we have to find out ways of making sense of it. Perhaps one of the things that one of those strangest and most difficult to understand things that men first began to make sense of in this kind of Rorschach blot interpretation way were the stars in heaven. And one of the ways in which they did this was to project upon the skies figures of all kinds of mythological monsters and beasts, such as the idea of a dipper for the Great Bear, those stars in the Great Bear that look, you know, like a ladle, or some people call them the plow. Or here, perhaps on a celestial sphere of this kind, you can see quite clearly the outline of the constellation Leo, the lion. A lion drawn in the sky, so that men could find their way about in the stars, recognize their outlines by associating certain groups of stars with familiar images. But you see, this is fundamentally a projection of ideas out of our own minds onto nature. Nature itself will take all kinds of different projections, and no one is necessarily the right one. They work for us so long as we agree about them. That is, so long as we abide by convention. And in Indian philosophy, the fundamental word for this kind of thing is the Sanskrit term Maya. I'm going to write that down for you. Pronounced Maya. And this word comes from a root in the Sanskrit language, Ma. And the word Ma is at the basis of all kinds of words that we use in our own tongue. It's at the basis of matter, of the Latin mater or mother, at the basis of matrix or metric, because the fundamental meaning of the root ma is to measure. And so it works in this sort of way. I was talking about our world being wiggly. You know, something like this. That is the typical sort of shape that we're having to deal with all the time. And I think you'll see at once that a shape like that is extraordinarily difficult to talk about. If I were talking on the radio at the moment and not on television, I would have the greatest difficulty in describing that line to you in such a way that you could write it down on a piece of paper in front of you without seeing it. But here you can see it, and you can understand it at once. But it isn't enough just to be able to see things. We want to be able to talk about them. We want to be able to describe them exactly so that we can control them and deal with them. I mean, supposing this were the outline of a piece of territory on a map, then you might want to tell someone an exact spot to which he should go. And then you would have to be far more precise about it than you can be when you just get the general idea of it by looking at it. And so we introduce then the idea of Maya by essentially doing this. This might be called a matrix. A line crossed, lines crossed by lines in a very formal, simple pattern. And the moment we do that, it becomes very easy indeed to talk about this wiggly line, because we could, for example, number all these squares across 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and so on. We can also number them downwards. And then in terms of numbers across and numbers down, we can indicate the exact points on this grid which cross the wiggly line. And by numbering those points one after another, we can give an accurate description of the way that line moves. And furthermore, supposing the line under our grid were not still like this one, but supposing it was wiggling in motion, supposing it was a flea or something dipped in ink who was crawling across the paper, and we wanted to know where he was going to go, all we would have to do would be to plot out the positions which he has covered, and then we could calculate statistically a trend which would indicate where he would be likely to go next. And if he went there next, we should say, by Jove, isn't that incredible? This little flea crawling across the paper is obeying the laws of statistics. Well, as a matter of fact, he isn't. What he is doing is, or rather I should say, not what he is doing, but what we are doing, is we are making a very, very abstract model of the way in which that line is shaped or in which that flea is crawling. We are breaking it up into little bits, whereas in fact it is not a lot of little bits. It is a continuous sweep. But by treating it in this way, as if it were broken up into bits, we are measuring it, we are making a Maya, and these cross lines are a Maya just in the same way as the idea of the lion, the Leo constellation in the stars is a Maya, a way of projecting. You see, this thing, it comes out of our minds, and we project it upon nature like this, and break nature into bits so that it can be easily talked about and handled.